So here we are, joined by two distinguished gentlemen, the Bugbear brothers. Uh, we have Bugbear Daniel and Bugbear Cam. And, I actually have kind of been in the same orbits in Instagram with them for quite some time. And yeah, so one of the things I really appreciate and why I really wanted to bring the Bugbear brothers on is their philosophical and very analytical approach to the goings ons in the RPG world, tabletop gamer world. And so I really want to share their wisdom with all of my drinking buddies out there. So, Daniel, Cam, why don't you introduce
Yes, sir.
yourselves real quick, and then we'll get rolling.
Sounds good.
Dan, you want to do it? You want to go?
You want me to do it? Okay. Yeah,
Oh
so Cam
yeah.
and I, we used to be coworkers together back around 2015, 2016. And we were working in a school together in the special education departments. And one day we decided to all have a game of poker with some fellow coworkers. And after I took everyone's money, we decided to move to TTRPGs. And
Take
I had
all the
never
monsters,
played,
buddy.
yeah, I'd never played Dungeons and Dragons. So when I said TTRPG, Cam showed up with like this old ancient dagger and like all these old modules, and I was preparing to run like, forget what it was called, End of the World by Fantasy Flight. But Cam was like, "Oh yeah, my apologies. I thought we were doing something else." And I was like, "No, that's cool. Like, what is that?" So then the week after,
Did he have the cloak on with the?
yeah, yeah, like there was this whole other
Full on
side to
Mark.
this guy.
You
Yeah,
didn't think
so
he was trying to bring you into a satanic cult?
I mean, even if he was, I was curious. I wanted to know what was going on. So, uh, yeah. So basically, the next week we got all the 2014 5e stuff together, and we started running, and we're like, we were messing up the rules everywhere, but we didn't know what we were doing. And within I guess a month there, we were meeting weekly. We were playing a lot, and then it wasn't till I think 2019 when I moved away that Cam, again, great at starting things, sent me a message and said, "Hey, we should take all this wonderful stuff that we're doing with our world lore, whatever else, and start popping it online. And we should write a module. We should actually take some of those stories and turn into something that other people can enjoy." And then maybe Cam will hand it over to you from there about the first module and what happened afterwards. But yeah, that was the start of things.
Right on.
Yeah, we just yeah, it kind of the majority of it started rolling after I moved to New Zealand. So that was a bit of a challenge, like coordinating between Canada and New Zealand. But yeah, so far I think we've got like what, 12 offerings so far. So we've managed to do it. But
Where are your offerings
yeah,
located?
we are at Drive Through RPG. Our hard copies are on Amazon. We're all over itch.io, coffee. Um, yeah, I think Dungeon Masters Guild. I guess there's a couple on there too, but
Trapped.
they're a little bit more proprietary over what's been put on there. So we kind of limit what we put on there because yeah, it's essentially theirs at that point,
Oh
and
yeah,
that's not something that we're really cool with.
Yeah,
Matt's got a story there.
yeah, I got stories about them guys.
Mm.
So yeah,
Mhm.
and we have uh been exploring quite a bit about what's going on in the gaming world, the tabletop gaming world. Jacoy and I, originally when Jacoy and I came together, we were like, oh, we'll share about adventures and miniature painting and all these things we love about the gaming world. And then it seemed like every time we would turn around, whether it was, WotC doing something dumb or Paizo or whatever, uh, it just seemed like there was this steady barrage of ideology coming out of the larger gaming companies. And And I think like the first video that Dracoy and I did was a video where WotC was committing to curating the language and pushing everything through sensitivity readers for the new core books coming out in 2024. And they were removing words like savage and civilization, because now you're making judgments on who's civilized and who's not. Slavery was chopped off there. And I, I kind of take strong objection to that myself, because it seems like what we see in the greater culture war, where leading up to the big explosion of the culture war, we saw like all of these arguments being architected, like you shouldn't, this is a microaggression, don't do that. And it escalated a little bit further, and to the point where like, you can't speak up if you're this demographic. And the reason is because of all these arguments that everyone's already agreed on before, that are microaggressions. Therefore, you can't say anything when we call you names, right? And so it felt like the start of that all over again, but in gaming.
Have you guys had that feeling yourselves?
Yeah. I kind of,
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering,
I mean,
what your take is on,
go ahead, Matt.
on that.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, essentially, gaming should be an apolitical space. That's my belief, and and it's all about it's kind of invading your personal space if you're using these supplements that are espousing kind of ideological narratives. And the danger in that, I mean, we've all played long enough that we can kind of go our own way, but we want this culture to continue, right? And it's going to change or affect who's going to get into this hobby. Essentially, it's going to they're driving the narrative, and the people who see this, some might be turned off, and some might be, okay, this is for me. But what we want is kind of as broad a population as we can get in this game. It just makes it more interesting, and we don't want to limit who can or who feels comfortable in the space and who doesn't.
Well, I think that's what WotC's intentions were when it comes to implementing things like safety tools and removing a lot of these words. So, do you think that their changes are doing exactly that, or do you think it's actually prohibiting like more people from joining the games?
Well, I think it's prohibiting some people. It's making some people more comfortable, and I think that's kind of their goal, is comfort, right? It's to make people comfortable in the space, and that's a noble effort if that's truly what they're after, if that's what they're trying to do. But at the same time, it's kind of alienating maybe an older subsection of the culture where we grew up on this, and we feel as though we didn't need any of that, and we were just happy being in an apolitical space. And so I guess what we have to think about is comfort the main thing that we're after here? Is that the goal? Because often we're exploring, we're pushing our boundaries when we're playing D&D. We're using our imaginations. We're experimenting with different moral things, and maybe comfort isn't the main thing that we should be striving for.
Yeah, I wonder how, attuned to their customer base WotC truly is. We've mentioned, Jacoy and I have had several videos where we talk about the different polls where they're gathering demographic information. And the polls are all held online, which means it's the demographics are going to be skewed towards the younger generation anyway because they spend most of the time online. The older players, they may be online, but like you said, they're pretty comfortable with what they're doing. And so they they're not going out to WotC's website to look up anything, and they're not really going to YouTube to look for advice because they've got their routine down, if you will. And so right away there seems to be a bias in the information they draw. And it really makes me wonder when WotC says, hey, it seems like our customer base wants safety over anything else. um, it makes me wonder uh, if they realize that their data might be flawed. Um, and I think it goes back into, like, for example, making the Underdark a bit more like the surface world. Like they're talking about having the evil become the exception rather than good in the Underdark, and the removing of and that was one of the other things they kind of curated. It all came out in the same article, was that mind flayers and beholders, they're very xenophobic. They want to destroy everything that's not like them or enslave everything that's not like them.
Right.
And um so if they want to get rid of those concepts, they've got to, it's almost like they're turning mind flayers and beholders into like Adam West Batman villains, right? Because what is the villainy? What is the conflict? What is it that the adventurers need to foil at that point? And um, you know, and I know that the 2024 Monster Manual isn't out yet, but we've seen some examples from the new Monster Manual. Um, and one of the things they were gonna do was eliminate alignment, but it seems like alignment's still in all the examples that they're giving. Um, I
Right.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's when you get into this, it kind of seems as though it's acting as a social commentary within the game, and we're really in this for escapism, right? I mean, that's
Right.
that's I don't want to be dealing with this stuff. I live in the real world, and like I'm not partial to it. So when I go into the D&D space or the TTRPG space, I want escapism. And I don't know if this is an appropriate venue for educating people. Is at a certain point, it seems like, with the sly flourish thing that's gone on, it's like, is this a venue? Are we educating people now? Are we teaching people lessons, or are we playing a game? Because, like I have a lot of ideas politically, and all sorts of things that have nothing to do with the game, and I don't infuse our products with that. And I'm in no position to be teaching anyone anything. And I don't think designers are either. So it's best left untouched, I think, because there's a lot of room for missteps. If you're trying to educate someone, especially distilling broad ideas and cultural issues, distilling it into a TTRPG game, there's so much room for missteps, and I just don't think it's an appropriate venue. I don't think video games are, and I don't think role-playing games are.
I'll agree to that. Definitely as a woman in this space, I really resent the changes that have happened because I think that their argument is they're trying to make everything more inclusive so that people like myself are more comfortable. But the matter of the fact is, I was perfectly happy with the things the way they were. And I didn't ask for some guy to come in and rescue me in the space and change things so that I'm suddenly more comfortable. I was fine.
Yeah, and it seems like, if we're talking about creating a product that appeals to the a wider audience, you really got to wonder if removing points of conflict from a game, because like it or not, like the old timers are going to be like, and by old timers I mean like anybody who started before 2014, really. But they're going to have their idea of what constitutes a great adventure and constitutes a great campaign. But as people learn going forward, like, if I'm a brand new player, I'm 16, I pick up the book and I start reading about all these things, am I going to be inspired to run a game to, uh, create a whirlwind adventure, as Donkey would say, and I just think that it's going to, in the long run, harm the product and harm Dungeons and Dragons. But I could be wrong. The a big a big issue I have is, it kind of leads back to what Dracoya says about having somebody else save us, um, because our videos, and granted, you know, over time, general attitudes and positions will curate the audience for us. So people who generally agree with us are going to subscribe, and the people who don't are going to ignore us. But when we first got started, we had a pretty good mix, and uh, I thought it was interesting, the number of people who were like, I'm a leftist, and but I still don't agree with this. So, and it kind of like,
Mm.
it's kind of interesting, but the number of people who would comment kind of angry messages about us opposing the idea of making the game safer and gentler for everyone, um really struggled with the implications of that. Like, okay, you've made this beautiful utopia, but what does that mean in 5 or 10 years to the people who we want to pass the game on to? Is it going to be? It's not.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not going to be as cool as the latest video game where they're slaughtering people in an airport, or like we've seen some pretty crazy stuff come out of the video game industry. And I know
Yeah.
that they're having their own deal, but there's still quite a bit of very extremely violent and crazy material coming out of that genre. So, I don't know if they realize that WotC, that they're competing in a growingly digital world, and they have to compete against and keep the attention of these kids, really, as the years go by. And and I understand that that's probably why they're going to the VTT, but I've constantly
Yeah.
argued that, like, without an edge, without a great story, and world breaking adventure hooks, really, why not just play an MMO?
Well,
Well,
without
that's the thing. And
conflict,
it's sorry, go
go on.
ahead. Um, yeah, I'm just thinking that the edginess is what got me into Dungeons and Dragons. It wasn't the comfort or the safety. It was yeah, it was the mid '80s, and I had heard all sorts of horrible things about it, and I'm like, oh, okay, and just really got into it that way, and yeah, just played it that way, and we always felt like you're kind of getting away with something playing Dungeons and Dragons. And I don't know, maybe it was just that generation, and maybe different generations need different drawing cards. Like maybe comfort and safety is going to be the drawing card to Dungeons and Dragons going forward, but I just kind of like that edginess. And yeah, it just seems like that is an important part of Dungeons and Dragons, just that anything could happen kind of feeling.
Well, without conflict, you can't really have growth. And by them taking away a lot of this conflict and turmoil in this world and making sure everyone's perfectly safe all the time, you can't make mistakes and learn. Not to say that Dungeons and Dragons can't be an amazing tool for a lot of different people to learn social skills or conflict management or communication. I think it's a great tool for that. But in order to have and create those skills, you do need conflict so that you can learn from that. And I think that WotC's making a
So
lot of
true.
mistakes, including like what they've done with their new book.
Yeah,
Yeah, and like to touch on that, Dan and I have both used TTRPGs in educational and therapeutic settings because we both work in mental health, and Dan's a teacher, and we've used that to great effect. And like we'd used 5e to do that, and but as rules change and make things a bit more comfortable, that if you're going to use it in a educational or therapeutic environment, the rules affect what you're going to address, and the more comfort that's involved, it's not going to be as effective. And yeah, so that's just touching on what you were talking about, but it's an important thing to consider. Without conflict, you don't have much.
Dan, do you have anything to add with that? Especially with your experience as a teacher.
Yeah, I think the thing that has been a bit bizarre is that there's this shift towards needing to coach dungeon masters about what they can and can't include in their games. And I guess it this is maybe a little too harsh, but like my thought is like stay in your lane. Your job is to provide me this tool set that I'm going to use to construct stories, and I'm going to make judgments about what is going to work with the players I'm with based on their age, based on how well I know them, based on if they're part of my community or whatnot. And I think dungeon masters have been doing that since the 70s. Like you just make judgments, and there's bad dungeon masters out there, and people
Sure.
leave their games. That's not going to change with this new set of parameters. Really, what I think is going to change is there's going to be this chilling effect upon what kinds of stories are coming into the public sphere, the intensity of the content that they deal with. And I think what I'm hearing you folks say, which I fundamentally agree with, is that our world is full of tricky problems that we want players to be able to interact with. Like we have more slaves living in the world today than we did during the early Americas. Slavery is still a problem.
It
Let
is.
there be evil slavers in your world because that's a real problem that we're dealing with today. So kind of dumbing down the content and say, well, we can't talk about that because that's going to offend someone's sensibilities. I really think that the person that loses out is your average player at the average table. So yeah, I see it as a development that has all the right justifications on paper. We're trying to get more people into the space. We're trying to be inclusive. I agree with Cam in saying, yeah, those are noble aspirations to have. But the question is, how are you rolling that out and what's it coming at the cost of? Because if it's coming at the cost of deep storytelling that's actually teaching people about the nuances of good and evil and how you go through the world and what goodness actually looks like, no, get rid of that stuff. We want people to actually struggle with these issues at the table. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, and then what they've been doing and saying about Gary Gygax and a lot of the founders of D&D in general, that's been outrageous. I think that they've been building their new game basically off of the bodies of our founders and their reputation.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there's
Well,
this.
that's the thing is,
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Cam. Go ahead.
well, like Dan and I are always saying, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. We're using what they've done and implementing it in our own way, but never for a second do we ever consider presentism. Like we say, presentism is a hell of a drug, where we just oh well, we're in 2025. Gary Gygax thought this, so he was a terrible man. You know,
And
no,
that's
people are going to say that about us in 25 years,
yeah.
One day. Yeah.
Well, and that's
or tomorrow.
well, and that's something that I have every time someone has come out against Gary Gygax, they're like, okay, so here's this sentence he said. Yes, of course I'm a misogynist. And it's like, see, he said it himself, boom, and it's over. And then you're like, okay, well, here's the full quote, and it's pretty clear that when you read that, he's being very hyperbolic and trying to be humorous, which doesn't come off real well off on
Right.
paper. But the big thing that just drives me crazy is how WotC will say, "Well, we never actually called them these names." What they'll do is like, "Oh, Dave Arneson, Gary Gygax, and others, Rob Kuntz or whoever, created this game." And then, like a few paragraphs later, the creatives were misogynist white men from, it's like, well, we never directly said which ones we were talking about. It could be any one of them. Certainly, one of them is a misogynist, right? So what we said is factual.
Right.
But I think it all started with this. It all started with them tagging um, all of the old TSR, and I think even third edition products with that. We know that language such as this was wrong then and wrong now. Like this disclaimer protesting their innocence and their reformity, right? Uh,
Right.
but I was surprised by the number of people who were like, it doesn't hurt anything. But it really set up the groundwork for some crazy, slanderous moments, in my opinion.
Yeah, and Thaco the clown, don't forget that one, right?
Yes. I mean,
Yeah.
it's pretty clear what they thought of the old timers. And I think that they would be surprised at the number of not just, you know, 50-year-olds playing 5e. But, when I was running programs at the local game stores to bolster the game, we had quite a few people in their 60s and 70s. So, it was a little shocking that they would, do anything that would, that might alienate a customer, right?
Yeah.
But that idea of safety and comfort seems to only extend so far.
Yeah, but to your point, right? Like that's just mudslinging. And like why why is that in our game space? Like it's again a bit bizarre that we're trying to create this rule set for collective storytelling where in my view the goal should be bridge building, that you should be able to have lots of different types of people at your table. And then these I view them as needless kind of attacks upon the progenitors of the hobby. And it's been going on for quite some time. It's as you pointed out, it's in these disclaimers before books. You see it in the characters that are being created. Uh, it's weird. I don't know. It seems to be something that's become fashionable to do in the publishing industry.
Have
Yeah,
you
and I know it's not just RPGs, in the children's book industry. I know some Judy Blume books, they removed the word fat, changed it to something else, like actually changing the words of an author and I think they were trying to do the same thing with Shel Silverstein, but that estate stood up to them and stopped them. Because a lot, like I said, in a lot of our early videos, we had a pretty good mix of people that would watch our videos. And, you know, what
Hmm.
we kept getting these messages about the paradox or tolerance paradox, where if you're too tolerant, but you have to like come down like a hammer on the people that deserve it. But, who are those arbiters of who deserves to be?
I think that's Nozick's argument, right? The paradox of tolerance is
Yes.
yeah. Yeah, but again, the funny part about that argument that is that it requires, again, this kind of superiority complex, or this view that you've got it morally figured out. Like the tolerance paradox, I think the examples Nozick gives, I'm gonna have to look it up again, are like, don't tolerate Nazis. Don't tolerate people that are actively rounding up and killing people. And somehow this has slid into, don't tolerate someone who thinks a little bit differently than you, or has a different intuition about how you ought to play a board game. So I think that there's something really strange going on there, where there's a level of seriousness that's crept into this gaming space. And the belief is that if you associate or play a game with someone who has a different sensibility, that you're somehow, you're in league with the devil in some cases. And it's bizarre to me because I can't imagine like just saying, yeah, let's play a game of cards. But before we do, I'd just like to know your views on colonialism, because if you think differently from me, there's no way we're playing cards together today.
And
Like it's just, it doesn't make sense.
and I've heard
For-
plenty of stories of that where a friend of mine was in a game where a guy came in. No, maybe it was a lady. I can't remember what, but in any case, she came in and she said, "Are there any Trump supporters here?" And if there were, she was going to leave. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not going to game with you. Like,
wow.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things like, you know, I can't imagine um being in a situation like that. I mean, I have my own stories about being confronted at conventions and stuff for not using safety
The
tools or
safety tools. Yeah.
screaming. And yeah, I mean,
And
she sold me to my face. She was a member of some organization that was trying to boycott Gary Con because they wanted Frank Menser canceled and excluded from the con and stuff. And
Wow.
but in any case, she said, this hobby is not for you old, literally said, this hobby's not for you old white men anymore. And I need to find something
I
else.
remember you posting that.
And it's like,
Yeah.
wow, like uh the attacks that are levied at people like the Gygaxes and the Kuntzes and whatnot. Because even or the Tim Kask, I know, had a problem even at one point. When he was not even like he had been the lead editor of Dragon magazine and then moved on to another company. And then later it was like, let's scour the archives and find out who we can attack for any, remote reason. And then his name came up on the list. But it's 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 crazy to me. And you brought up the word presentism earlier, um, how everything is analyzed, the degree to which everything is hyper analyzed, right? And the first indication I actually saw this, I don't know if you guys remember, there was a professor who did an analysis of Dungeons and Dragons and found that, you know, like 90% of the art featured a male warrior or whatever it was, but it was only like some minuscule
Yeah.
percentage portrayed a female, in a strong role or whatever. And I'm thinking to myself, at the time I remember thinking to myself, well, that's silly, who cares? But that's the sort of thing that kind of snowballs. Well, he's a professor, he must have some legitimacy, right? And I've
Sure.
that's another thing that's come up, the fact that, well, it's coming out of academia, therefore it must be right.
Yeah, that's sometimes called idea laundering, like money laundering, right? You
Yes.
spin it through a certain number of departments that are not really doing scientific research. They're doing normative consensus in the academies, and then you spit it out in fancy sounding jargon and papers, and it suddenly gets accepted as something that's got some level of consensus or authority behind it. Yeah, but it's to your point, there's this great sense of irony there, isn't there? Like there's this sense of, okay, we care about inclusion and tolerance, but we're not going to tolerate you. We're not going to include you. And then there's this sense of like, no, everyone's capable of changing, having these complex moral identities, but Gygax is the devil. So there's these paradoxes that are beginning to grow in these spaces, and they've grown elsewhere in our culture. But I think the thing that has struck me, and maybe why I've begun to become a little bit more vocal about it online, is that part of what we're supposed to do in a healthy society is when something is deserving of ridicule, it's ridiculous, we ridicule it. We say, this, no, this doesn't belong here, or this is going to be caustic or destructive to something that we all view as valuable and important touchstone in our communities. So I think people need to start recognizing that those attitudes, which are quite draconian and yeah, unkind to people that think differently, they're going to destroy the hobby space over time, and people have got to speak up a little bit about it. So, yeah.
Yeah, how many comments have we seen where it's just, I'm really getting tired of this, you know?
Yeah.
But and that is one tactic too, is to wear down the person, wear down the community until they won't speak out anymore. Because like it or
Yeah.
not, WotC is the big dog. I mean, they're still 50% of the space. They took a big hit in the OGL, which I think was huge. Some of these smaller companies like Troll Lord Games it really helped them quite a bit. And I think that's a good thing. Like people lament the idea that WotC might fold and Hasbro might just shelve the IP because that's what they kind of do. With IPs, they just kind of hang on to them.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of like at this point, I'm kind of at the point where like, you know, is that going to be such a bad thing?
Yeah. It can't get any worse. I would like to take a
And
moment and remind
that's sad.
I know. I would like to take a moment and remind everyone to like, comment, and subscribe. If you guys are enjoying things so far, let us know with a like and a comment. Next, I really wanted to talk to you guys about the artwork. So I looked at your Twix accounts and I noticed all the D&D artwork that you guys had, which by the way, I adore. I think that the artwork that you guys have been sharing is fabulous, but I'm sure you guys have seen the artwork that WotC published in their new book.
Yep. Cam's the big art.
Yeah. Well, growing up, for me, art was just as important as content, to be honest. I was 12 years old and I see Larry Elmore and Jeff Easley, and I'm just astounded by what I'm seeing. It's like blowing my mind. And, it still holds up today. And it's just beautiful work. And not to say that today's art isn't good, it's definitely different, but it doesn't evoke the same, I don't know, danger, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the composition of the art, for one, kind of invokes the Avengers Assemble, like, so, and it speaks to the difference in philosophy of the generations, probably, where today's 5e characters are superheroes and they're invulnerable and they're going to kill everything, whereas a lot of the early artwork, at least Golden Age, um, showed characters in peril, and that's kind of speaks to the difference in the way the games are run too. I think when you look at OSR, there's a lot less emphasis put on backstories, and because you don't know if the characters are going to survive. Like, we'll wait for a backstory because I'm not going to write a backstory for a character that's just going to be fodder. But yeah, the art speaks to that, and you can tell a lot uh, about the health and how the game is run just by looking at the art. And I think, yeah, the older I was just, I'm an old, fuddy duddy probably, but I'm more partial to that kind of stuff.
I really believe that art is kind of like the soul of a D&D or any fantasy RPG, any RPG really. You know, without good art, the likelihood that someone will even pick it up and have a look and say, "Hey, this might be for me, this might not be for me," is deeply uh affected by the art. And um, you know, that was one of the things I learned when I first started publishing. Like, um, I had the very first adventure I ever published, put art, and it was selling, but it wasn't great. And then I just decided, well, I'm going to switch up the cover, and then it blew up. Um, not only is the art like something that you can like pick up, and and get a feel for what's going to happen in the adventure or source book, but it also I think it also sets an expectation for the type of play. Like if you look at Shadow Dark, that dark and gritty art, like what's behind me here, all the bugbears.
Yeah.
The it's all black and white art. It's kind of old school, married to a little bit of 5e, but it's very deadly and it gives that presentation or that feel. Whereas I really feel like the 2024 artwork is dull and just about as dull as the game they're trying to like get people to buy. At least the lore side of things, right? So
True. I mean, we're not interested in baking or like dwarves serving muffins
Well,
or
but wait,
yeah,
what if they
it just
bake
doesn't.
in the smithery? Then it's fine, right? I mean, those two things go together.
Yeah, totally good then. Like, yeah,
yeah,
definitely. There's a
assembling
time
the
and a place for everything.
sushi on the forge is the key to good sushi.
Yeah,
Um,
it doesn't invoke adventure or danger at all, but yeah,
Oh, but
that's
it
okay.
invokes food poisoning.
and that's funny that you mentioned about like I'd never really thought about the Avengers Assemble aspect to art because I was just looking at some of the paintings, and um and it's like the old school art is very much organic in that the action picks up where the image is showing you is where usually the adventurers are surprised and they're all like, what? Uh
Yeah,
one picture after another. It's a very organic setting. It's nothing's posed, you know. And there are some exceptions to that, but for to a really strong degree, it's noticeably different than what you get today. But you know, one of the things that, and I think we've kind of like making allusions to this, but you guys made a post not long ago, where you kind of outlined the top three or four arguments that we keep seeing in favor of all these changes that WotC made. And I don't know if you guys want to like expound on these for a minute, but the first one, and if you read them, like it seems like they're all kind of the same thing, just stated in a different way. But
yeah,
you don't have to use it at your table. That
yeah. And I mean, fair enough. Fair enough. You don't. Um, but we are kind of engaged in creating a culture at the same time. And D&D is a relic. It's a beautiful culture that's kind of compiled its content over decades. And fair enough, you don't have, nor should you tie your identity to a corporation. But
Right.
at the same time, there's nothing that should prevent you from voicing discontent over one of the biggest names in your favorite hobby. And definitely everyone's table is different, but it also influences what, like I was saying before, what new players would expect entering the hobby, or what's acceptable at conventions. So it goes beyond your own table, and it's just something that I guess we want to continue. I mean, we want the hobby to progress in a positive way, but not at the expense of jettisoning a whole bunch of content. I just don't think that's the way to go forward with it.
From my perspective, once we get through all four of these arguments, I when I read that you don't have to use it at your table, if let's say WotC chose not to make any course corrections with lore, and terminology, and they didn't use the sensitivity readers, I would say the same thing. You don't have to use it at your table. Like
Exactly.
It goes both ways.
yeah. So the next one you guys talked about, it's not hurting anyone. So what's the big deal?
Yeah, and I mean that goes back to comfort, right? Is this something that we're striving for, or are we striving for something like an edge of your seat kind of experience? Also, who are we talking about when we're saying it doesn't hurt anyone? It's definitely making a section of the hobby very uncomfortable, or else there wouldn't be the kind of firestorm that there is in the hobby. So if it's not hurting anyone, then why do we see this kind of backlash against it?
Yeah, can I add to that? Like, I think one of the, so maybe I'll just preface it with any moral judgment anyone in the world makes is usually based on perception of harm. So when you see judgments coming out either direction, it's because people think something harmful is going on. So the hurting anyone is tricky because the harms can sometimes be more immediate or less immediate, and they can also be more obvious and out there or less obvious and out there. So I think I gave a stupid example on our story on Instagram, but like if you were having a kid's birthday party and some person enters the birthday party and says, "Well, you can't be eating cake because it was a symbol of the aristocracy in the during the French Revolution," like you ruined the kid's birthday party. It's like these kind of problematizing everything, politicizing everything. It does change the atmosphere at the table. It changes the atmosphere in the hobby. And yeah, it's hard to like point to exact moment and say, yeah, it affected that thing right there. But everyone feels it. It's making people walk on eggshells. It's changing the type of stories that are making it to press when it comes to our official campaigns that are coming out. So yeah, some harms I think are just more obvious than others, but I definitely don't think no harm's being done by these shifts. I think there's definitely something happening.
Yeah, I
That's
think
such a great example. I really like the birthday cake. That's a
yeah.
great example.
Yeah, it's the rule of unintended consequences, or the because I would look at that and going back to the first argument where I said, if we left everything the same, it's not hurting anyone. So what's the big deal? People would say, well, having that word slavery in there would make someone uncomfortable, and that's going to hurt them. Or you're encouraging genocide when you have orcs going through and massacring everything. But you could also flip that on its head and say, if like I were scared of spiders, for example, what's the treatment for that? The treatment is exposure to
Exposure.
spiders, right? And so I don't see like keeping people sheltered as doing them any good, you know?
Well, and
And
to add on to that, Matt, I would argue that having these types of situations actually increases empathy. It increases one's ability to start thinking of things from a different perspective. It's like, oh, I don't give a crap about these types of people. Oh, well, hang on. It's kind of weird when it's this village. I kind of give a crap. Well, maybe I do give a crap about this group of people.
yeah, a good DM will try to paint a complete picture, and sure in
Yeah.
there are there are DMs and whole groups out there. They're only interested in crushing their enemy and seeing them driven before you. But that's fine. That's how they want to play the game, you know. But I guess my point is, and a retort to what I said would be, well, it's not D&D's place to be a therapist, you know. But the I no, I don't think it's anybody's place to be a therapist except for licensed therapists. But I think that once you start talking about words as actual assault, like physical assault, I think you've kind of gone off the deep end. You've jumped the shark. You got Fonzie's jacket on and the water skis on. And it just that argument just doesn't hold any weight to me.
I
But
think Dungeons and Dragons is a great way to explore some traumatic things in a person's life in a controlled environment. And I think it's a great way to explore some things that you wouldn't or shouldn't do in real life, but in a fantasy type of environment where in reality, there's not any consequences to a bad roll or a bad decision. And now you can kind of explore these bad rolls and bad decisions in a safe way.
Totally. And it's also like I don't know who these players are that have this sanitized version of D&D. I definitely know at my table, I'm like, holy crap, you want to do that?
Yeah.
Like they'll be like, no, we have to kill everyone in the village. Sorry, I have a dog with a dog toy beside me. One second.
it's all
Yeah,
good.
no, that's not a real D&D table.
And in 40 plus years of me DMing, well, GMing more than just D&D, but in 40 plus years, and I've run countless conventions, probably DM'd for hundreds, if not thousands of players. I've had one person in that all that time say, I'm not comfortable with that. And it was an adventure where there were lots of spiders. And the person saying, I'm not comfortable with that, wasn't even a player. They were just somebody like watching. And I'm like, then you'll probably want to go somewhere else because this whole adventure is about stopping these spiders. So, yeah. And that's really like, and that's really like, if you go to any convention, you're going to sign up on their list, and there is a synopsis of the adventure or whatever event you're doing. And, it if you are frightened of spiders and you see in the synopsis that there are going to be spiders, you don't sign up for that. You don't go in there and say, I demand that it be changed. You know. Anyway, but yeah, it's when you ask the question, who are these players? I mean, I've got a lot, obviously anecdotal, because there's been millions of sessions played where I wasn't there, but I feel like I've got a good cross section traveling, going to different conventions in different states and whatnot. And yeah, I just don't see it. But all right, next one. If you don't like it, play something else. This is my favorite one.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, I mean that's always kind of the go-to, hey? Like it's we want to be part of your community, and then oh, your community is doing something wrong and it needs to be fixed. And then oh, you don't like what is going on in your community, then go somewhere else. And it's rinse and repeat. And that's not it's a hollow argument because we're all very invested in our hobby or we wouldn't be here. And so it's oversimplifying things. I mean, we've got a lot of investment in it. D&D has a huge influence over the RPG ecosystem, and it's just way too simple. I mean, we're not going to go anywhere, and the fact that we're exercising our voice and critiquing what's going on in no way that's not a solution. If you're unhappy with something, you want to change it, then why don't you go somewhere else? Well, no, I mean, this is exactly what is going on in the ecosystem right now. They're not happy with dryads being female or whatever, succubuses
Eggs.
being female. It's like they're changing that. So, you know, like our response is, well, that's a bit silly. You might want to rethink that. Our response is not go somewhere else and create a new game. So it's a bit of a hollow argument.
I totally agree with that. You know, I um I don't know why, this is just how I'm wired, but anything with a that I'm a intimately active with that has a legacy. You know, I care about preserving that legacy. And so, for example, I'm a big baseball fan. And of course, baseball has this huge legacy. And really, RPGs does too, because we could track RPGs back to, you know, the 60s, and they're basically the very first Braunsteins, you know, the first instances of role play. And so when they say, why don't you play something else? It's because I care about the legacy of D&D. I care that it's a good game, or at least a playable game, you know. And
Right.
I care that um and this is another love of mine, which is mythology. So you're bringing up dryads, and we know that hags are getting the same treatment. Succubi could be any gender they want to be. You know, like that was another one. And I'm kind of like, well, that isn't the history. That is not the mythology, which all of these creatures were based upon. You know, and so there, there are, you know, what's interesting is that like with the Medusa back in second edition, they had a male version of Medusa, but they didn't call it Medusa. They called it something completely else, something else, which is cool,
Right.
you know. Um,
That makes
and
more sense.
so, so when I see them messing with this legacy, and you know, they're coming out and straight up saying we're going to be changing the lore. Um, you know, I have a problem with that. It's like retconning things that are meaningful to me. I'm going to push back against that. And you could say, well, why don't you play something else? Well, something else isn't that thing that I've been playing for 40 plus years.
Right. That's
Yeah.
exactly it.
It's
Uh,
also this thing where I don't know. It seems to particularly be happening around sometimes people call them sapiens or sentient creatures, but there seems to be this belief that the moment something has language, it needs to be morally complicated in order for it to be good lore or interesting. And I think people misunderstand that when you look at like the old Celtic myths of Europe or even what the Dutch thought or these different areas, Fomorians and Fae and fairies and goblins, these were part of nature. It was a representation of this unwieldy unknown that you had to mythically engage with, and it wasn't meant to be complicated per se. Like it was meant to be like in the same way that if you see a grizzly bear in the woods, you run. If you see a pack of goblins in the wood, you run. But I don't know why that shift has occurred. It seems to be now that the moment any of these entities in the game can use language and have a culture, that culture must be capable of being all things. So yeah, I don't know why that shift has occurred, but it seems to be what's going on with the succubi, the hag, the goblins, the
Orcs.
gnomes, right? Yeah.
I
The
think
orcs
it's
have
got,
to have feelings.
Gnolls.
I think it has to, it's kind of by extension, they have to. Like they've made this argument with certain creatures. And for that argument to hold water, it must extend to all these others. Um, and otherwise the argument
Right.
is bunk, right? And it's easily laughed at. But um, yeah, I definitely think that that it's a snowball that will never stop rolling if they continue down this path. Because
Yeah.
it'll naturally extend to everything, you know. And why are you using a longsword? That's a Eurocentric sword. We can't have that. We better call it just a sword. Well, not all cultures use swords. The South American tribes, they use spears. So, we
Yeah.
can't have swords in the game.
It's almost the like the caricature, the actually like the glasses person, right? Like it's I don't know where that's from, but yeah, it's these corrections that there's an exception somewhere. So you must be aware of the exception and you need to build your lore around these exceptions. And it's funny because you see it in pop culture too. Like I think the newest three Star Wars movies, right? Finn is the good stormtrooper, and we had Drizzt, of course, and there's that's existed forever. This kind of idea that you can get an exception. But what's funny to me is that that idea, no one had a problem with it. But what's kind of taken over now is that it's a correction. You have to correct everyone. So if there's just a group of goblins, you need to make sure that that person understands that that's just one bad group of goblins. There's good goblins out there. So it's this very rigid kind of corrective structure that people are putting on their dungeon masters and other players. And I think just people have no, or from my perspective, people have no appetite for being nitpicked and corrected and constantly reminded of various viewpoints. Like people are like, I'm here to play a game. I just want to chuck some dice and tell a story.
Exactly. Amen.
Yeah, that is an excellent point. And I guess that kind of leads into, before I go on down the road I was going to go down, to like your last point or the last argument that you guys discussed, and that's with what's wrong with making the game safe and comfortable for everyone. And I always have a real problem with the word safe. What is safe? Um,
Right. Well, life isn't safe, right? And when you're talking about in a therapeutic environment, the number one thing is to not give someone a false narrative and reinforce their um, maybe inconsistent thinking. And this obsession with safety is doing just that. It's reinforcing a false narrative where the real life isn't safe. Playing an RPG is, well, ideally it should be safe because it's imaginary, but for a lot of people, things come up. And yeah, you can't avoid that. You can't be live in a bubble.
yeah, and that it's kind of related to number two, which was it's not hurting anyone, is basically the same argument, just reworded in a different way. And, you know, I my response to this immediately when I was reading your original post a few days ago, like I read this line and the first thing that popped in my head was, what's wrong with making the game fun? you know? So what they're talking about is probably making the game safe and comfortable for less than 1% of the gaming population. Maybe it's a little more. Maybe it's even a full percentage. But I can't imagine that there are very many people out there who legitimately will drop on the ground in the fetal position and have thoughts of suicide because somebody used the word civilization, or because the Underdark is a terrible place.
Well, one thing that they teach you in therapy is people who have gone through traumatic experiences. One of the things they teach you in therapy is how to cope with that. Because unfortunately, fortunately, we live in a world where just because you had this horrible traumatic experience, like that sucks, but the world doesn't change for you and it doesn't adjust for you. And so part of going to therapy is learning how to adjust your trauma in this chaotic world. And it's the same thing in every aspect of that world. So maybe they are catering this game to that 1%, but I would say that they're doing that 1% a huge disservice by doing that, because all that does is create this safe bubble where everyone else has to cater to them, and the expectation is that everyone in the world will then cater to them as well, and they don't learn how to cope with these traumas in a safe, fictionalized fairy tale like environment.
So
I
true.
love that. Whoops.
And I think it also, like, one of the features of generalized anxiety disorder, for instance, is that it's almost like you're gradually becoming braver or you're gradually becoming more fragile depending on the steps you're taking in your life. And generalized anxiety disorder can get to the point that a person can't leave their room, right? Because what's happening is they're reinforcing the belief that everything in their environment is a threat, versus challenging those beliefs about what should register as a threat and how to approach threats in their environment. So yeah, I think it's worrisome at a deep level that one of the better tools that we have out there, which is imagination, right? It's our ability to dream and to play with hypotheticals. That this capacity for us to say, okay, I wonder what would happen if I was a warrior, if I was challenging a dragon. We all have dragons in our own life, whether it's the boss you don't want to talk to or the friend you're having an argument with. What if our response to that is, no, no, like I need you to change that because that doesn't fit what I'm ready for right now. So I don't think that paradigm can succeed. I think we need to go back to I'm responsible for making myself a robust, anti-fragile individual who's going to be in the world and be ready for curveballs because they're coming.
So, last thing that we really want to talk about is where do we predict WotC and gaming is going? And I want to once we discuss that, I want to talk a little bit about some things I've seen and and or maybe we should talk about the sales first, and then we can make an educated guess. So several weeks ago, I guess what was it, August when the Player's Handbook came out, or September? And there was all these videos going around. Hey, this is the sales. They've sold 1,300 copies, or whatever it was. It was really low, and that was obviously just big box at Amazon that was reporting. But there weren't a whole lot of sales, and comparatively, like the number of reviews on Amazon, which sells the book probably at the largest discount you're going to get. We're, I think it's like something like 700 reviews right now, which sounds like a lot, but when you consider that the 2014 Player's Handbook was in the tens of thousands, it's like a huge difference. But
Right.
so everyone began speculating, hey, the sales of the book don't seem to be very robust, but WotC was saying fastest selling book in the history of D&D, period. And so everyone was like, well, it must be the PDF sales. That's what they must be basing it on. So I went out and I'm always like sharing my screen and whatnot. I went out to the D&D Beyond, and maybe you could buy the PDF elsewhere as well. But I went out to D&D Beyond and took a look at the best sellers. And here, I'll share this with you. And what we're seeing is that the Player's Handbook 2014 is number one, and everything pre-2024 stacked up behind it. Which is interesting because, that would suggest, of course, there are variables, but it would suggest that maybe they're trying to just develop some fear of missing out by saying it's the fastest selling book ever. What do you guys think?
Yeah, it's really hard to say until you actually see the numbers. I mean, you can take their word for it, but yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I can see why the 2014 Player's Handbook has sold so well. But the new one, it's been on X. It's been relatively quiet. Honestly, I haven't seen a lot about it. Same with Instagram. I mean, we haven't seen a whole lot about it besides WotC saying that it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. But um, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I I guess the question is, let's if it were indeed selling as well as they would want, you would think that they would actually give us numbers, but instead they're just saying
Mm.
accolades, you know. Um, so I'm not sure what that means. I mean, they they obviously have to report to their shareholders and whatnot, but I do know that if D&D 2024 fails, that is a huge deal for Hasbro. I think, when all of this started, and I think it was prior to the um the OGL scandal, they had said, hey, or this they being Hasbro said, hey, we really want to focus on our billion-dollar IPs, which is Magic the Gathering, Monopoly Go, and some other things. And they didn't want to spend any time. So, but they thought they could turn D&D into a billion-dollar IP. Like right at that time, it was what, like $100 million IP. And they thought they were going to do it through the VTT and whatnot. So it's really, really important for D&D that 2024 does well. But do you think that all of the self-inflicted wounds um, have pretty much doomed that, or do you think that they're going to pull something out?
That's hard to say.
Well, it's yeah. Go ahead, Dan.
No, I'm just gonna say like the problem is, right, is that they need to find new ways of making revenue is how they're gonna increase their market share. So since the days of TSR, that's largely been through book sales, and it's unsurprising to me in the digital age that they're moving more towards PDFs and D&D Beyond subscriptions and stuff. I can only speak for myself. Since some of the more recent debacles, I try not to buy um, their books and some of their, I don't know what you would call like their core products. But there's things that I'm always gonna buy, like I don't know what those little guys are called, Nolzur's unpainted miniatures and stuff like that, because I need them for my table, right? So there's all kinds of revenue streams that are just happening through licensing, whether it's to WizKids or some of these video game companies like Larian. Um, but yeah, I can only worry because when a company like Hasbro gets their hands in the cookie dough, they tend to yeah, go the direction of EA Sports with loot boxes and all these
Ugh.
skins and these various ways in which you really just turn something that's meant to be a communal experience into a product, which is unfortunate, but just the way capitalism works sometimes.
Well, and that's one of the things that I think they brought over all of the digital folks to take the helm. People from Microsoft, Chris Cox, and all those guys all came over from Microsoft. And in that world, they Microsoft owns their source code. They have a much tighter control over um, what people can do with their products. And then they came over to a world that couldn't be more different than that. A world in which they, as Hasbro WotC, are giving us the framework to run a game. Each and every table in existence, unless, and even if they're running, Strahd, for example, Curse of Strahd, or every single table is going to run it a little bit differently. But there are even more tables out there that are running homebrew worlds, homebrew campaigns, adventures, And so you have literally, when we talk about the multiverse, I always think about it in terms of the tens of thousands of gaming tables out there, right? Maybe even more, however many there are. I think about each and every one of those worlds and how every one of them is distinct from the other. And so they when these software people came over, like I think they really underestimated what the culture was around tabletop gaming. Because I personally think it can't be more different than the video game space, where if they make a Assassin's Creed game, they're printing money. Whereas the
Right.
the all of us gamers have alternatives. Okay, you don't want us anymore. We don't need to use your rule set. We can use the rule set from one edition ago or two editions ago, and I can still run my same campaign. You can't stop us.
Right. And the issue is entering the virtual tabletop um, arena. You're suddenly competing with the more you try and video gamify um, role playing games, um, you're competing with already established companies that have a long history in video games. So you've gone from being, the 500-pound gorilla in RPGs to the new kid on the block in kind of a video game kind of world. And I think it remains to be seen how well they're going to do in that, because it won't take long for other companies just to pick up on what D&D did with Baldur's Gate and just go with that, and their infrastructure is ready to go. So they're entering into an arena that's already pretty full.
Yeah, and that's why I struggle with the idea. I think at one point there was somebody who had said, "Here's how many people we need. We need RVTT to attract for us to get to that $1 billion mark." And I think it was something like, and I could be wrong, but I thought it was something like 200,000 or something like that. They need 200,000 players on their VTT. And I'm thinking to myself, well, the primary place you're going to get that number is going to be from Roll20, Fantasy Grounds, the groups that are already playing using a VTT that they're paying money for. The problem is that if I'm on Roll20, I've already bought all the books, you know. Do I want to repurchase everything so I can go on WotC's fancier interface wise, but still not as good as an MMO uh, platform? And I think that's a tall order personally. But
Right.
the advantage they have is they've integrated D&D Beyond. That's the twist.
Yeah.
So I don't.
It's fundamentally aimed at players now too, though. Like that's the thing is they're trying to get young players who are digitally savvy, building their character sheets on something like D&D Beyond. But it's funny because, like Cam was saying, when I run it at schools, I ran a one shot for some of the kids that were in the D&D club at the school, and use paper, and none of them understood at all where their stats were coming from or how it how the cookie was made. They've been so used to just clicking things on D&D Beyond. So
Hmm.
at that moment, I kind of was, yeah, had this little light bulb turn on, which I was like, oh, there's a dependency there. People are unable to play their beloved game because they don't actually know how to build a character or anything like that. They're just having something in the background do it for them. Of course, there's good sides to that, but over time, I think it's just probably going to be a cycle of creating new needs in the player base and then saying, well, we're here to help. And it only costs you $4.99 a month, right? So
Yeah, is that how much was? Does anyone know how much the D&D Beyond subscription is?
yeah, I don't use, I'm not sure.
Yeah. No idea.
Yeah, neither am I. I can't remember. I thought it was like $10, but I could be wrong.
I'm sure
Whatever.
one of our followers will be more than happy to let us know in the comments section.
Yes. Plus, you'll be paying for the VCT and all that other stuff. I don't. I mean, I really want D&D to somehow correct itself from this tailspin. I think it'll take a cultural shift, or at least a perceived cultural shift, because I think that all of this
Mm.
safety stuff is more a perceived shift, given the bubble that the folks out there in Washington are in, um, than an actual shift. And that's my personal opinion. But I guess we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it'll be interesting one way or the other, I guess.
Well, I
Yeah.
want to thank you guys for coming on. I really appreciate it. I hope we get to do something like this again real soon. Um,
Oh, I'd love to.
the next crazy thing that they talk about, maybe we'll have you on or something. I, uh, I,
Wait a
I,
month.
yeah, the trial or tribulation of the month, right? But I'll thank everybody. Please comment, like, subscribe, make Dracoya very happy. Go to dnddice.com, promo code pickled to support the channel. Good deal. They have some cool dice, including some Fallout dice, which I think are my favorites right now. But
Or if you have any knolls or anything else that you'd like painted, let me know.
all right, let her know. Until next time, come on back, have another round on Dracoya.